They told me, "You have nothing, not even the right to stay on the porch." Those were the exact words, spoken as casually as if they were commenting on the weather, tossed in my direction while my son held the door open with 2 fingers, like the house itself would catch something from me if he let me linger too long. I remember the tone more than the phrase, flat, practiced, smooth with the confidence of someone who has spent years convincing himself that cruelty is just practicality with better lighting. And I, 78 years old, in my worn navy coat with its frayed cuffs and loose lining, stood there holding a plastic grocery bag they'd stuffed with a few of my things, as if they were doing me a favor by not throwing them directly into the trash. It still amazes me how quickly a life can shrink from rooms and memories to a bag that crinkles when you breathe next to it. But that afternoon, I didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't even sigh. I simply walked down the steps and listened to the door close behind me with a soft final click, like a period added by someone who never learned to love commas. I suppose I should say who I am now, though it hardly matters in the grand ledger of the world. My name is Margaret. I'm 78. And at the moment of telling this, I'm sitting in a tiny rented room above a bakery that smells of yeast and burnt sugar long after the ovens go quiet. The window sticks, the radiator hisses, and the lamp on the nightstand flickers whenever someone in the building flushes the toilet. But it is mine, not borrowed, not tolerated, not contingent on anyone's shifting patience. Mine. Yet when I think back to that day, that moment when the last door closed on the life I thought I belonged to, I don't feel triumph or bitterness. I feel a kind of surreal stillness, as if the world tilted slightly and I was the only one who noticed. People imagine that heartbreak announces itself with screaming or accusations or dramatic scenes played out under dim lighting, but the truth is quieter. It arrives in a sentence said without eye contact, in the firmness of a hand guiding you out, in the way no one bothers to ask if you have someplace to go. It didn't begin that day, of course. Pain never starts where the line eventually breaks. It begins miles earlier, in soft fractures no one pays attention to. I can trace the first hairline crack to a morning 2 years before, when my son started speaking to me with the slow, overly careful enunciation people use for foreigners or malfunctioning appliances. "Mom, you probably don't understand how hard it is for us," he'd say, palms spread in a gesture I used to find boyish and earnest, before it turned into a shield he hid behind whenever responsibility brushed too close. Or to the moment his wife began introducing me as Dan's mother-in-law figure, as if erasing the blood link softened the discomfort of acknowledging where he came from. Or even further back, when I started paying part of their mortgage under the illusion of mutual support, believing that sharing resources meant sharing love, not realizing I was teaching them how effortless it was to take without thanks. But none of those small betrayals prepared me for the day they decided my existence was a burden they could no longer afford emotionally, socially, or aesthetically. I remember standing in the kitchen earlier that same morning, stirring tea in the mug I'd brought with me years ago, a ceramic one with fading lavender painted along the rim, and thinking how strange it was that even my mug seemed out of place in their sleek white rooms. My home had been warm, cluttered with photographs and knitted blankets and mismatched cushions, the kind of home where people dropped crumbs and addressed one another by name. Their home was a gallery pretending to be domestic space, and somehow, without noticing, I had become one of the exhibits slated for removal during renovation. When they told me to leave, I wasn't surprised, not in the sense of shock or indignation. There was simply this odd sensation of recognition, like hearing a song you've never consciously listened to, but somehow know all the words to. Maybe because for months they'd been talking around me instead of to me, having hushed conversations in hallways, shutting doors a little too gently, but always just before I reached them, exchanging glances in the presence of guests whenever I tried to participate. I had become a shadow at my own family's table, a placeholder they moved around to balance the aesthetic of generosity without ever investing in the substance of it. So when they asked me to pack a few things for now, I didn't even ask what now meant. I knew. Women my age always know. Our departures are decided long before the announcement. What I remember most vividly is the cold. Not the weather. It was mild that afternoon, the kind of lukewarm spring day where the air smells faintly of soil waking up. No, it was the cold inside me, the kind of clean, sharp cold that clears the fog from the mind. I stood on the sidewalk with that plastic bag cutting into my fingers and realized, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that there was no version of the next hour or the next day or the next decade in which I would be invited back through that door in any way that wasn't transactional. I was not a mother in that house anymore. I was barely a memory. I was a task crossed off a list titled Things to Finally Handle. People like to imagine that the elderly become invisible gradually, as if sight fades inch by inch, but invisibility can strike all at once, like a curtain pulled down, and you look around realizing you can hear your own breathing louder than anyone else's interest. And so I walked. I didn't know where I was going, but after a lifetime of adjusting my steps to the needs of others, the mere act of choosing a direction felt almost rebellious. The pavement was uneven, and my knee ached with every block. But the ache was honest, uncomplicated, mine to bear, without apology. Passing cars didn't slow. Passers-by didn't glance up from their phones. Even the wind seemed indifferent, brushing past me as if I were furniture on the street. It's strange, how quickly a life can unravel in the absence of a fixed address or a place to sit without being moved along. One moment you belong somewhere, the next you're weighing which park bench has the least exposure to wind. I didn't break down. I didn't rage or sob. Instead, an odd calm filled me, as if some part of me had expected this ending all along and was almost relieved to finally reach it. Because once everything familiar collapses, there is a peculiar freedom in the rubble. You no longer have anything to lose, and that makes you untouchable in a way comfort never could. By the time evening came, I knew I wasn't going back. Not that day, not ever. And that, strangely, was the first moment in years when I felt something close to ownership, not of a house or a room or a title, but of myself. The sky was dimming, the streetlights humming awake, and there I was, a woman with no home, no plan, no safety net. But for the first time in decades, I was no one's obligation, no one's burden, no one's justification for resentment. Just a person standing between what had been and what might still be, if I chose it. And choose I would, though I didn't know it then. I only knew the sound of that closing door was not an ending, but a threshold. I knew the cold settling in my chest wasn't despair. It was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. The unmistakable, bone-deep certainty that survival, once stripped of illusions, becomes a story only you can write. I sometimes think the moment of betrayal should have sounded louder, like the crack of a board snapping or the metallic ring of something valuable shattering across a tiled floor. But in reality, it came wrapped in softness, in the kind of gentle tone people reserve for conversations with strangers' pets, as if too much force might make the creature bite. My son stood in the doorway of the house I had helped him buy. No, not helped, paid for, though I didn't understand the difference back then, and he said, "Mom, let's not make this a big emotional thing, all right?" He didn't look at me when he said it. He stared over my shoulder toward the living room, as if checking whether the blinds were drawn evenly. His wife hovered behind him, arms crossed, wearing the kind of expression people use when they're bracing for a bad smell. I could tell they had rehearsed this together, maybe even practiced which lines each would deliver so the conversation would feel seamless, controlled, coordinated like a speech for a charity gala, where sincerity is optional but presentation is mandatory. And then came the sentence that sliced through whatever illusion of security I still clung to. "We've decided it's no longer healthy for you to stay here. It's better for everyone if you go." Not asked, not suggested, decided. For a moment, I didn't move, because I needed a few breaths to understand the shape of what was happening. Betrayal never feels the way stories say it will. It doesn't arrive with a flash of indignation or the sharp sting of immediate sadness. It seeps in, slow and viscous, like tar sliding through the cracks of your ribs until every inhale feels heavier than the last. I looked at my son, really looked, and saw not the boy I raised, but a man who had spent years sanding down every rough edge of empathy until all that remained was the polished surface of ambition and convenience. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, irritated by my silence, as if my processing time was an inconvenience he hadn't factored into the schedule. "Mom," he added, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. We'll help you figure things out later, but right now we need space. We've talked about this. You know how overwhelmed we've been." That was the moment the floor inside me gave way, not because they wanted space, not even because they were casting me out, but because he said, "We'll help you later," with the same tone one uses when promising to. Check the expiration date on milk. A soft lie, easy to discard. His wife jumped in then, adding her own rehearsed cruelty packaged as logic. "You've had a good long run here, but it's time to transition. We can't keep managing everything. You're still capable of taking care of yourself, so you should." It's empowering, really. Empowering, as if being pushed out the door with a plastic bag of belongings was an act of feminist liberation. She stepped forward and placed the bag into my hands, her manicured fingers brushing mine with the tiniest shudder, like touching something sticky. I could have argued. I could have reminded them of the years I held my dying husband's hand while still cooking meals for their children, of the winter I spent babysitting their 3-year-old so they could attend corporate retreats in warm places, of the time I paid their property taxes quietly because I saw the overdue notice sitting under a pile of fashion magazines. I could have told them that when I moved in after my stroke, I thought I was joining a family, not checking into a temporary facility where my stay could be terminated without notice. But one of the strange gifts of old age is recognizing when silence holds more dignity than pleading, so I didn't say any of it. I simply thanked them for letting me know, because sometimes politeness is the only armor left to someone who has been stripped of everything else. When I walked out of that doorway, I expected at least a farewell glance, some flicker of remorse or uncertainty, but they both turned away before I reached the sidewalk. I heard the soft thump of the door closing, and then the rapid staccato of the deadbolt sliding into place. That sound, small, functional, final, was the true catalyst. The moment reality crystallized into something sharp enough to cut through denial. I understood then that whatever bond I believed existed between us had been dissolved, not in that instant, but long before. Dissolved through years of small dismissals, ignored phone calls, birthdays replaced by text messages with emojis instead of words, and the persistent insistence that my opinions were from another era, meaning irrelevant. They didn't push me out of the house that day. They simply enacted the ending they had rehearsed in their hearts long ago. The street felt foreign under my feet, even though I had walked it 1,000 times. I looked around and realized I didn't know where to go, not because the world lacked destinations, but because I had spent so long in a space where every choice had been filtered through someone else's convenience that I had forgotten what it meant to choose for myself. Betrayal does that. It narrows your inner compass until you can't tell direction from habit. I kept walking because standing still felt like an invitation for the ground to swallow me whole. I was aware of the weight of the bag in my hand, heavier than it should have been given how little was inside it. A sweater, a photo of my husband, my medication, and a comb. They had packed my life with the efficiency of people clearing out a guest room for new visitors. The catalyst wasn't just that they discarded me. It was the sudden, devastating clarity that there was nowhere to return to. No childhood home waiting, no sister's couch available, no old friend who hadn't already disappeared into her own thinning. World, age is a country where the borders shrink every year, and by the time you realize your passport has expired, you're already too far from the embassy. I passed the bus stop, the one with the dented bench where teenagers sometimes gathered, and considered sitting, but something inside me resisted the stillness. If I sat, I feared I might never rise again. So I kept going, block after block, the light fading, my legs trembling slightly, my breath moving through my chest in shallow waves. Hours later, though it might have been minutes or days, time behaved strangely during emotional exile. I reached the river. I don't remember choosing that direction, but perhaps my body knew I needed water, something ancient and indifferent enough to witness me without judgment. Standing there, watching the slow current move under the bridge, I felt the truth settle over me like a heavy shawl. I was alone in a way I had never been before, not the aloneness of widowhood, where memories keep you warm even as grief chills the edges, but the aloneness of dispossession, the kind where your former life drifts away from you like a boat whose anchor rope has snapped, leaving you on the shore, with nothing but the imprint of where it once rested. And that was the moment, quiet, cold, strangely steady, when I understood that whatever happened next would be entirely up to me. The house was gone. The family was gone. The safety net had been pulled so neatly from under me that I hadn't even seen the hands doing the pulling. But I was still standing, and sometimes, when a life collapses, standing is the first and only catalyst you need to begin again. I walked for hours without truly understanding where my feet were taking me, guided more by the instinct to keep moving than by any coherent plan, because plans belong to people who have homes and places to return to, not to those who have been peeled out of their own lives, like the last page torn from a book no one intends to finish. By the time the sun dipped low enough that the shadows began to stretch like thin fingers across the pavement, I felt a kind of hollow fatigue settle into me, not the dramatic kind that pushes you to collapse, but a quieter, more insidious exhaustion that makes each step feel like an argument between habit and hopelessness. I paused near a shuttered hardware store and leaned against the wall for balance, listening to the mechanical hum of the city transition into evening mode. And it occurred to me with an unsettling clarity that I wasn't heading toward something. I was simply drifting away from what used to be mine. The first real escalation wasn't a dramatic event. No sudden violence or cinematic downpour. Nothing that could be pinned neatly onto a timeline as the moment everything worsened. Instead, it was a slow tightening, the kind you don't notice until you're already gasping. The temperature dropped as night crept in, sharpening the air into something that made my joints protest. And I realized how unprepared I was for even the simplest demands of being outside without a destination. I checked my purse for money and felt an embarrassing flush of shame when I counted only a few crumpled bills. Nothing that could secure a room, not even the cheapest one, because money, like love, disappears faster than we admit when we keep giving it away to people who treat it as their due. So I kept walking, searching for some corner of the world that wouldn't push me aside the moment I tried to rest, but sidewalks and storefronts are unfriendly to older bodies, and even park benches seem to tilt their backs in rejection once evening settles. Eventually, I reached the underside of a wide overpass where the concrete pillars held the highway aloft like indifferent giants, and I noticed a small cluster of shapes, blankets, bags, figures curled with their faces turned away, spread along the wall. I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the strange, painful awareness that stepping into that shadowed space meant acknowledging a truth I wasn't ready to name, that I no longer had a place in the world that wasn't borrowed from someone else's. Exhaustion. Still, cold has a way of persuading more effectively than pride, so I walked closer, careful not to seem threatening, though the notion of a 78-year-old woman posing any danger is laughable even to those who know nothing about desperation. One man lifted his head as I approached, his eyes sharp despite the grime on his face. "You knew?" he asked, not unkindly, more like a gatekeeper checking whether I understood that this place had its own rules. I nodded and murmured something about needing a place to rest. He pointed to an empty stretch of concrete near a pillar and said, "Stay on that side. No one will bother you if you don't bother them." It was a simple arrangement, stripped of the complicated politeness that fills the homes of people who pretend to love each other. I thanked him and lowered myself slowly onto the ground, feeling the cold seep into my bones like water into old wood. I didn't cry. Tears require a sense of safety, and I had none left. The nights became a kind of rhythmless existence, each one blending into the next, marked by the steady roar of traffic above and the shuffle of bodies rearranging themselves for comfort that never truly came. I learned quickly that the world treats people without addresses as background noise, something to step around or avoid eye contact with. Shopkeepers grew tense when I lingered outside their doors. Bus drivers refused to stop if I didn't wave dramatically enough. And pedestrians looked through me with the same expression they used for graffiti or broken payphones. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something colder, a practiced indifference that made the days feel longer and the nights heavier. But the small degradations were the ones that cut the deepest. The first time someone crossed the street to avoid passing me, I felt an unexpected sting, not because I wanted their company, but because I realized they saw me not as a woman, but as an inconvenience, a potential threat, a reminder of something they'd rather not imagine for themselves. The first time I asked for directions and was ignored, I discovered that invisibility is not the absence of being seen, but the suffocating presence of being dismissed. The first time I tried to warm my hands in a cafe doorway and was told to move along, I understood that the world had rules for people like me, rules written in invisible ink but enforced with bureaucratic precision. My body responded to this new existence by shrinking inward. I found myself walking more slowly, not out of frailty, but out of the instinct to avoid drawing attention. I slept in short, shallow stretches, waking at every sound, because safety is a luxury reserved for those with doors that lock. My thoughts grew quieter too, as if conserving energy, and I spoke little even to the others under the bridge. We shared space, not stories, because stories require trust, and trust is a currency scarcer than warmth on nights when the wind slices through wool like it was made of paper. Food became another negotiation. I scavenged more than I ate, not because I lacked hunger, but because I lacked certainty. The soup kitchen lines were long, and the volunteers' smiles were often strained, as if kindness were something they rationed carefully to avoid burnout. I learned which grocery stores threw out produce late in the evening, which alleys were safe, which dumpsters were sealed. Shame dissolved somewhere in the first week, replaced by a pragmatic acceptance that survival leaves no room for delicacy. I stopped checking my reflection in windows because the face looking back was a stranger, tired, thinner, eyes dulled by the knowledge that she had no one waiting for her. Yet the worst part was not the cold or the hunger or the indifference. It was the quiet erosion of identity. Days passed without hearing my name spoken aloud, and I realized how much of a person's sense of self depends on being acknowledged, even casually. My son used to call me Mom when he needed something, and Mother when he wanted to sound mature, but now I had neither name nor role. I was simply a body in motion, a presence that occupied space without belonging to any of it. Every morning I woke with the same dull ache in my chest, a mixture of disbelief and resignation, wondering how a life so full of work, giving, endurance, and love could be reduced to a narrow strip of concrete under a bridge. And yet beneath that ache, something else began to form, faint and barely noticeable at first, a kind of fragile clarity whispered by exhaustion itself. Nothing loud, nothing triumphant, just the slow realization that if the world had decided I was nothing, then maybe I had the chance to become something entirely new, unburdened by the expectations that had once shaped me into someone who gave everything and received so little in return. I didn't know it then, but the quiet worsening of those days, the hunger, the cold, the small humiliations, the endless walking, was not the end of my story. It was the soil in which something unexpected would take root, something that would eventually grow strong enough to make the rest of the world turn its head and listen. But in that moment, all I knew was the weight of the air, the hardness of the ground, and the steady truth that the life I had once lived was gone, and something else, lonelier, harsher, but strangely honest, had taken its place. I used to believe that transformation arrived with thunder, with some dramatic gesture from the universe that made a woman sit up straighter and say, "This is the moment everything changes." But in truth, it came to me on a morning so ordinary that it might have dissolved into the blur of all the other gray days, if not for one small, persistent detail, the sound of my own breath in the cold air, and the realization that I was still alive enough to hear it. I had woken under the bridge after a restless night, when the temperature dropped lower than my bones knew how to forgive, and while the others were still bundled in their makeshift nests of coats and tarps. I sat up slowly, my joints protesting like stubborn hinges, and noticed a scrap of cardboard lying near my feet. It was nothing special, just part of a discarded box, softened at the edges by rain and dirt, yet for reasons I couldn't name, it caught my attention. I picked it up, brushed off the grit, and held it in my lap as if it were something fragile. Then, without planning to, without even understanding why, I reached into my pocket for the small pen I'd kept since before everything fell apart and wrote a sentence. The sentence wasn't profound or poetic. It wasn't even particularly important. It was simply a description of the woman who slept 2 pillars down from me, the one who muttered old nursery rhymes in her sleep. I wrote her name, at least the one she used now, and a few facts she had shared one night when she was lucid enough to speak clearly. And when I finished writing that single line, I felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, not like a revelation, but like the soft click of a lock turning just enough to let in a sliver of air. I looked at the words, uneven and shaky from the cold, and realized they were the first words I had written in weeks, maybe months, and they felt strangely steadying, like a tether thrown across the widening gap inside my chest. I wrote more because I didn't know what else to do. I wrote about the man who had given me my corner under the bridge without suspicion or pity. I wrote about the old veteran who carried a folded flag but never spoke of the war. I wrote about the woman with silver braids who collected broken umbrellas and fixed them with duct tape to give to newcomers. None of it was polished or structured. It was simply a record of what I saw, what I remembered, what I felt tugging painfully at the edges of my mind. The more I wrote, the warmer my hands became, as if the act of shaping letters coaxed life back into my fingers. That morning, something else changed in the way I observed the world. For the first time since being pushed out of my own home, I stopped walking to outrun the growing panic and instead began moving with purpose, small as that purpose was. I walked to find more stories, more fragments of lives the world had already written off. I listened in the soup kitchen line, sitting between people whose voices carried entire histories in single sentences. I watched the patterns of fatigue on the faces around me and realized each one held a kind of dignity that no one above ground bothered to see. I asked questions, not intrusive ones, not the kind meant to pry open wounds, but the ones that let people remember who they were before the world decided what they had become. And every answer, every sigh, every pause went on to those scraps of cardboard, napkins, wrappers, notebook pages someone had thrown away. I gathered stories the way some people gather coins, with the quiet desperation of needing proof that your existence still counts for something. The real midpoint, though I didn't understand it fully then, arrived the day a volunteer at the soup kitchen noticed me writing while waiting for my bowl of lentil stew. She was young, with tired eyes that looked older than her smooth skin suggested, and she wore a knitted hat slightly too large for her head. As she passed me the bowl, she glanced down at the cardboard I was scribbling on and said, "You're always writing. What is all that?" I shrugged, embarrassed, because the last thing I wanted was to seem like someone trying to romanticize suffering. But she picked up the piece of cardboard, read the few sentences I had written, and said with a seriousness that startled me, "This is good, really good. You should keep going." There was no flattery in her voice, no condescension, only an earnestness I hadn't heard from anyone in years. She told me her name was Leah, that she volunteered because she had once been homeless herself, and that stories like these mattered because people only think they understand homelessness until they are forced to see the people inside it. She suggested gently and without pressure that I try collecting these notes in one place, maybe even turn them into something someday. I laughed at the idea, not because it was absurd, but because I didn't know how to hold something hopeful without worrying it might shatter in my hands. But that night, under the bridge, I pulled out a plastic bag I had found earlier and began sliding every scrap of writing into it, organizing them the best I could. I realized I had been creating something without meaning to, a kind of chronicle of the forgotten, and that realization filled me with a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my posture changed. I held my head higher when I walked. I looked people in the eye when they spoke to me. I found myself speaking more often, sharing small parts of my own story when someone asked, without the usual fear of being dismissed or judged. And though my circumstances had not changed, my hands were still cold, my nights still restless, my stomach still often empty. I felt a strange ember of purpose burning inside me. It didn't warm my body, but it kept my spirit from freezing entirely. There was one evening in particular that crystallized this growing shift. I had been sitting near the riverbank, far from the noise under the bridge, sorting through my notes by moonlight. The river moved with its usual steady indifference, reflecting the pale night sky in trembling ribbons of silver. I read through the scattered stories and felt an unexpected calm wash over me, not because the stories were comforting, they weren't, but because they were real, and realness had become a rare and precious thing in a life where everything else felt stripped away or disguised by someone else's expectations. As I sat there, a sentence came to me, not about someone else, but about myself, and I wrote it with a steadiness that surprised me. I am not finished. It was the first time in months that I had declared anything about my own life. Those 3 words, small and unadorned, felt heavier than all the packed bags and slammed doors that had pushed me onto the street. They felt like a reclamation, a soft rebellion against the idea that older women are meant to fade, to step aside quietly, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention or tolerance their families extend. That night marked a turning within me, subtle yet irreversible. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was observing, recording, rebuilding, even if only on scraps of cardboard. The world hadn't changed, but I had begun to, and that was enough to shift the ground beneath me, creating the faint outline of a path I hadn't yet dared to imagine. There came a period when the days blended so quietly into one another that time felt like a fabric worn thin by too many hands. Yet within that fabric, something began to twist, a tightening I could sense even before I understood its shape, like the subtle shift in weather when a storm decides to gather itself before anyone notices the wind has changed. I had grown almost accustomed to my strange new rhythm of existence. Mornings by the river, afternoons collecting scraps of other people's forgotten histories, evenings pressing those fragile memories into the growing bundle of pages in my plastic bag. But life, especially the parts of it we think we have escaped, has a cruel way of circling back to remind us that we do not get to choose all the chapters we inhabit. It began with a letter, though calling it a letter feels too generous for something so startling and out of place in the world I now lived in. One of the shelter volunteers approached me hesitantly with an envelope in her hand, my name written across the front in my son's handwriting, the handwriting I used to be able to recognize even in a stack of school papers scattered across a kitchen table. She said someone had dropped it off earlier, then walked away quickly, as if afraid of being asked why she was delivering something from a life I had been pushed out of. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, the weight of it somehow heavier than its physical shape suggested, as though every unspoken accusation and delayed regret was stuffed inside, along with whatever words were waiting. When I finally tore it open, I found not an apology or a plea or even a question, but a neat, polished letter written in a tone so clipped and composed that I could feel the coldness in each line. He said they had been worried, that my sudden disappearance had created significant distress, that I had acted irresponsibly by leaving without informing anyone, and that the family had been forced to alert authorities. The irony of being accused of disappearing by the very people who had erased me long before they physically removed me was almost laughable, but the sting still found its way under my ribs. He wrote that they wished to meet to discuss next steps and that I should call immediately. He used phrases like "in everyone's best interest" and "return to stability," phrases that sounded more like corporate damage control than anything a son writes to a mother he claims to love. There was no mention of the day they had handed me a plastic bag and told me I had nothing, no acknowledgement of the words that had shut the door on the life I had trusted them with. Nothing except the subtle implication that whatever had happened was somehow my fault, as though I had not been pushed, but had simply wandered off like a confused child. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in my bag with the same care one gives to something that is both dangerous and fragile. I carried it with me over the next few days, feeling its presence like a stone pressing against my side, a reminder that the past was not content to remain behind me. The escalation came slowly at first, like the approach of footsteps you can sense before you hear them. I began noticing small signs that someone had been looking for me. A description passed through the volunteer network, a question asked at a soup kitchen, a man in a too-clean jacket walking the path near the river and glancing at every face with the intensity of someone hunting for something they were not sure they wanted to find. And then one afternoon, when I returned to my corner beneath the bridge, I found a business card tucked under my folded blanket, the kind of card that smells faintly of office air and fresh toner. It belonged to a lawyer hired by my son and his wife, the kind of lawyer who specializes in family affairs, which is a polite way of saying he is good at making inconvenient people disappear on paper long before they disappear in person. The card carried a short message: "Please contact me immediately regarding urgent matters." And though it had no details, I understood instinctively what it meant. They didn't want me back, not truly. They wanted control, the same control they believed they had been entitled to before I stepped out of their carefully constructed structure. They had realized, perhaps too late, that they could not finalize the sale of the house without my signature, the signature they once took for granted, the one they thought they could obtain through guilt, manipulation, or the sheer exhaustion of an old woman who had nowhere else to turn. They might not have known where I slept at night, but they knew I was alive, and the realization that they wanted something from me again sent a cold wind through the thin canopy of resilience I had tried to build over those long, harsh weeks. It was around this time that the journalist appeared, a woman named Clara, who introduced herself one afternoon as I sat writing near the pier. She said she had heard about the woman who writes stories on cardboard, and she wanted to know more, not in a voyeuristic or exploitive way, but with an earnest curiosity that made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years. She asked gentle questions, the kind that felt like invitations rather than interrogations, and I found myself telling her about the people under the bridge, their histories, their humor, their grief, the way their lives had unfolded quietly in the shadows of a society that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. I didn't talk about myself at first, but she had a subtle way of drawing out deeper truths, and eventually I told her the story of the day I was told I had nothing. She didn't look surprised, only deeply sad, as if she had already heard variations of the same story too many times. It was Clara who first suggested that the writings I carried in my bag could become something larger, something that might reach people beyond the cold concrete and the narrow strips of shade where we tried to survive. She said there was power in what I had collected, a rawness that could not be replicated by writers who had never sat in the brittle air of displacement. At first, I dismissed the idea. Who would read the words of an old woman who lived beneath a bridge, who wrote on scraps of discarded packaging because she had nothing else? But Clara's belief did something I hadn't anticipated. It created a tension between who I had become and who I could still choose to be, a tension that felt both frightening and strangely hopeful. Meanwhile, the pressure from my former life increased. I received a second letter, this one more insistent, reminding me of legal obligations and shared property interests, phrases wrapped in a tone that was somehow more threatening for its politeness. A volunteer told me that my daughter-in-law had been asking around the area, showing people my photograph, spinning a story about a confused elderly woman who had run away from home. The idea of being portrayed as a runaway was almost absurd enough to make me laugh, but beneath the absurdity lay a sharp fear. If they ever found me, they would not be interested in my story or my survival. They would want signatures, compliance, a performance of weakness that would allow them to return to their neatly ordered lives without the messy complication of acknowledging what they had done. The escalation crescendoed one chilly evening when I noticed a familiar figure standing near the waterfront, looking around with the restless agitation of someone who was certain they were close to what they sought. It was my daughter-in-law. Seeing her there sent a tremor through me, not of longing or regret, but of the instinctive fear that comes when a predator enters a clearing. I watched her from a distance, my breath tight, my hands trembling slightly. She had always been composed, meticulous. But now there was something frantic in her posture, something strained in the way she kept tapping her phone, as if expecting me to materialize in front of her. When she turned in my direction, I stepped behind a pillar, heart thudding in my chest, and waited until she moved on. I realized then that I could not remain hidden forever. They were searching with a determination that hinted at desperation, and desperate people rarely act with kindness. Later that night, under the harsh glow of a street lamp that flickered as though unsure whether to stay lit, I made a decision that felt like carving a new doorway through the thick wall of fear surrounding me. I went to Clara and agreed, for the first time, to tell my story. Not just the fragments I had gathered from others, but the full story of my own descent and survival. She listened with a quiet intensity, her recorder barely audible as it captured each tremble in my voice, each pause that held years of unspoken pain. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine gently and said, "This deserves to be heard." And for the first time, I believed her. The world I had left behind wanted to reduce me again to a signature, a legal footnote, a problem to be tidied away. But the world I was entering, a world of words, truth, and witness, offered something I hadn't felt in so long that I had nearly forgotten what it meant, a sense of agency. I didn't know then that the box of collected writings I had been guarding like a fragile organ would someday become a book read by millions, or that the people who had thrown me away would find themselves confronted with the living proof of my resilience. All I knew was that something had shifted irrevocably. I could feel the pressure tightening, the past closing in, the search for me growing sharper and more aggressive. Yet amid all that tightening, a thread of power wrapped quietly around my spirit, whispering that the part of me they had tried so hard to erase had survived, and it was ready to rise. I had always imagined that the moment of reclaiming one's life would feel like triumph, a blazing, almost cinematic surge of triumph that lifts a woman out of her shadows and sets her in the center of her own story. But the truth arrived differently, with a calmness so startling it felt like a quiet tide, pulling away the last remnants of fear tucked into the corners of my mind. It began on the morning I received the third letter, the one that dispensed with illusions entirely, written not in the strained politeness of the first two, but in the polished severity of legal language sharpened to a point. If I did not make myself available to sign documents related to the house, they would be forced to pursue more formal measures, as though I were not a person they had discarded, but an obstacle standing between them and a new kitchen renovation. I read the letter twice, then placed it carefully beside my stack of stories, and for the first time, I did not feel the familiar tremble of dread. Instead, I felt something settle inside me, an anchoring, a certainty that I had been drifting toward without realizing it. Clara had been working tirelessly with me over the weeks, helping me shape the recordings and notes into something coherent, something that breathed with the real voices of the people I had lived beside in the shadows. We met in the small corner of the library where no one bothered us, surrounded by the quiet promise of books that had survived long after their authors were gone. She would read aloud sections of what I had written, her voice steady, her eyes sometimes shining with a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. When she told me the draft was ready to send to publishers, I felt a pull between disbelief and fragile hope. But the culmination, the real turning point, came the day she received an email from an editor who said that what I had created was a raw, unfiltered, necessary testament to the human spirit, and he wanted to meet as soon as possible. Clara was ecstatic, her hands flying to her mouth in disbelief, but I sat very still, as if any sudden movement might shatter the reality forming around me. I wasn't excited, I was resolute. Something deep inside whispered that this was the moment I had been walking toward since the day the door closed behind me. Yet before I could take the next step, I knew I had to confront the shadow that had followed me like an echo. My son and his wife, who continued to hunt for me through legal corridors and whispered inquiries. Ignoring them had been a temporary refuge, but true freedom required a firm boundary drawn with the same steadiness they had denied me. The decision formed with the clarity of a blade. I would face them, not to reconcile, but to reclaim, not with trembling apology or lowered eyes, but with the unshakable understanding that they no longer had any claim over my choices or the narrative of my life. So I asked Clara to accompany me, not as protection, but as witness, because something about having another woman by my side felt like acknowledgement of the lineage of mothers and daughters who had been silenced, dismissed, reshaped until they barely recognized their own reflections. We met my son and his wife in a small legal office that smelled of polished wood and artificial citrus, a place where disputes were filed away neatly in drawers and real suffering was reduced to paperwork. They arrived late, flustered, her eyes scanning me with pity, rehearsed for the benefit of onlookers, his face shifting between irritation and the discomfort of someone forced to play the role of dutiful child. He greeted me with a brittle smile and said, "Mom, we're glad you're safe," a statement so hollow it almost echoed in the room. The lawyer cleared his throat and began speaking quickly, outlining the documents that required my signature in order to finalize the sale of the house, emphasizing phrases like joint ownership and responsible legal resolution. But I raised my hand gently and the room fell silent. It was the first time I had interrupted anyone in that family in years, and for a moment even the lawyer looked startled. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table, not with force, but with the steady assurance of someone who finally understood her own worth. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a formal statement drafted by a social worker who had interviewed me weeks earlier, confirming that I had been evicted without consent or proper support, and that any attempt to portray me as mentally unstable or missing was unfounded. The second was a letter I had written myself in long, deliberate handwriting, stating that I would no longer be signing anything related to the property until a full investigation of my removal from the home was conducted. As they opened the folder, I watched their expressions shift, not dramatically, but with a small tightening around the mouth, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, the faint tremor of people realizing that the person they thought they had defeated had risen in a way they never anticipated. My daughter-in-law was the first to speak, her voice brittle. "Mom, why are you doing this?" The question hung in the air, absurd in its innocence, as if she truly couldn't see her own hand pushing me out the door months before. I looked at her, then at my son, and I felt no rage, no need to punish. I felt only a quiet clarity. I told them I was no longer living at the mercy of their intentions, that I was reclaiming my narrative, and that the house, once a symbol of support, was now a symbol of betrayal, and I would not be used to facilitate their convenience anymore. My voice didn't shake. If anything, it grew steadier with each word. They tried to argue, to guilt, to diminish, but the lawyer, sensing the shift in the room, interjected cautiously, suggesting they reassess their approach, which was the polite legal way of saying they no longer held the upper hand. My son looked at me then in a way he hadn't in years, not with empathy, but with the startled recognition that the version of me he had relied upon, the silent, accommodating, self-erasing mother, no longer existed. It was not triumph I felt in that moment, nor vindication, but a bittersweet sorrow that this confrontation had been necessary at all. When the meeting ended, Clara and I stepped outside into the cool evening air, and for a long moment I simply stood still, letting the breeze wash over me. I felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because I had finally stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. That night, back under the familiar sky near the river, I opened the folder of manuscripts we had been compiling and read the first few pages aloud to myself. The words felt larger than me, larger than the cold nights and the hunger and the discarded cardboard. They felt like a beginning I had never allowed myself to imagine. The next morning, I signed the publishing agreement. The pages that had once been scraps tucked into a plastic bag were now in the hands of people who understood their worth. And as I placed my signature on the final document, I felt something settle into its rightful place inside me, something firm, irreversible, unshakable. I had crossed a threshold that no one, not my son, not his wife, not the world that had looked through me, could undo. I was no longer the woman who walked away from a house with a plastic bag and trembling steps. I was the woman who walked back into her own life with a pen, a voice, and an unburnable truth. If I had known that the road from that bridge to the small sunlit room where I now wake each morning would be as long as it was, I might have doubted my ability to walk it. But life rarely asks us to understand our strength before we use it. The book, the one born from scraps of cardboard and whispered memories under concrete pillars, made its way into the world with a swiftness that felt almost surreal, carrying the voices of the forgotten into homes where people had never once stopped to wonder how easily a life could be dismantled. Letters began to arrive, not like the cold ones my son once sent, but warm, trembling with gratitude, written by people who said my words had given them the language for the things they had endured in silence. Strangers thanked me for telling truths they thought no one else saw. Some wrote that they read my story to their aging mothers. Some said it helped them understand their own failures, their own disappearances, their own quiet survivals. And while the numbers, those bewildering figures the publisher kept naming with growing astonishment, should have felt like a victory, what moved me more were the women who stopped me on the street or outside the bakery downstairs and said with a look that held decades of unspoken history, "You told part of my story too." The money changed my circumstances, yes, giving me walls that were mine alone and a bed that didn't shift with the weight of the wind, but it didn't change the deepest parts of me. I still wake early when the sky is the pale color of forgiveness and sit by the window holding a cup of tea, listening to the faint hum of the city. Sometimes I trace my fingers along the spine of the book, not out of pride, but out of a quiet astonishment that something born from so much loss could grow into a vessel that carried so much healing. I think often of the people still living under that bridge, the ones whose stories fill those pages, and I visit them whenever I can, not with charity, but with companionship, because I have learned that the greatest cruelty is not poverty, but abandonment, the way the world turns its gaze away from those who no longer fit its polished image. I sit with them, listen to them, bring them copies of the book so they can see how their lives ripple outward now, touching people who once pretended not to see them. As for my son and his wife, they eventually stopped contacting me, not out of resolution, but out of the quiet recognition that I had stepped out of their control forever. The house they tried so desperately to sell remains entangled in legal threads they no longer have the will to untangle. I don't think of them with anger anymore. The bitterness burned itself out long ago, leaving only a thin layer of ash that the wind of time slowly carries away. I hope, though I will never say it aloud, that one day my son will read the book, not to see himself in its pages, but to understand the woman he never truly knew, the woman he assumed would crumble the moment he withdrew his approval. Maybe he will see that breaking a person is harder than he thought, especially a woman who has spent a lifetime holding others together. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, I find myself writing again, not because I need to prove anything, not because someone is waiting for the pages, but because the act itself feels like a return to the truest part of me. The words come softer now, more reflective, shaped less by survival and more by understanding. Sometimes I write letters to the woman I was during those bleak months under the bridge, telling her she did not endure in vain, that every shiver, every hungry night, every step taken with no destination was carrying her toward a future she could not yet imagine. If someone had told her then that she would one day sit in a warm room holding a book with her name on it, she would have laughed at the impossibility. But maybe that is the strange mercy of life. It rarely reveals its gifts before we are ready to hold them. And when I think of the women who will read my story long after I'm gone, women who are standing in doorways where they are no longer wanted, women whose families have made them feel like burdens rather than human beings with histories carved into their bones, women who believe they have nothing left to claim, I want to leave them with one truth that carried me through every cold night. You are not finished. Even when the world turns its back, even when the people you raised walk away, even when every door closes, there remains a part of you that no one can discard, a quiet ember waiting for breath. You may feel invisible, but invisibility is not erasure. You may feel alone, but loneliness is not the end of your story. I know this because I once believed I had been stripped of everything, and yet here I am, living a life built from the pieces no one valued. So if you are standing on the edge of your own unraveling, if you are holding the fragments of a life that has been taken from you, listen to the voice inside that has not given up, the one whispering under all the fear. Stand. Stand even if your knees shake. Stand even if you do not know where to go next. Stand because the world has not yet heard your final chapter, and because your story, yes, yours, is still unfolding.